Dear guests, please give a warm welcome to our next speaker, Alexander Stubb.
Många tack. Mitt modersmål är faktiskt svenska, men jag tror att det är lättare att jag talar engelska idag, för att annars skulle ni bara förstå när jag säger nej, nej, nej. So, it's really nice to be here today, and I was listening to the Prime Minister with great admiration, and I was reminded with a smile, internal smile, that probably the best working title in the world is former Prime Minister, because you don't have to take any of the shit and you still get to keep the name. But by way of introduction, it really is wonderful to be here today, and as you will know, I've had close connections to Denmark and great admiration for a long time. My first visit to Denmark was in 1975 to Legoland. I then subsequently moved on a little bit and became good friends with Lykke in academic circles. And funnily enough, of course, when I was a diplomat, I had the great privilege to work with Skutte Kristoffersen. Then when I became an MEP, everyone knew Jens Peter Bonde, with whom I still seem to hang out at Club La Santa in Lanzarote. He is there, topless, which spare the thought, writing books every year. And then later on I moved on to politics, and I was actually colleague of Per Stig Møller, great professional. We used to call him Sunshine. I promise I'm giving up the stand-up comedy soon. I then was a Europe minister together with Nikolai Vammen, which was a great privilege, and I also worked very closely actually with Helle Thorning-Schmidt, and we have a close connection in that both of us studied at the College of Europe in Bruges. She subsequently married a Brit, and so did I. She subsequently became an MEP, I followed suit, and then both of us were PMs, and now both of us are ex-prime ministers. I'll just finish off by saying Finland qualified for the Euro Cup in football for the first time ever, and our first match will be here in Denmark. Remember, you might be stronger, but we'll never forget what you did to us in ice hockey in Herning in 2018. So be ready. What I'll do today in my allotted 15 minutes is to basically try to give you 3 points of where I think the world or the world disorder is going. And at the same time, it's a bit of a test because I'm working on a book and the structure of a book. The 3 points that I'll try to suss out in terms of welcoming the new decade, challenges and opportunities is 3 key dates which have molded who we are. The 3 key dates will be 1945, 1989, and 2008. Secondly, I will outline what I would call the 3 challenges or opportunities or megatrends of our generation. They will be climate, technology, and welfare. And finally, I will outline, perhaps as an eternal EU optimist, a power triangle which is trying to find solutions for these 3 challenges, and the power triangle and the models being China, the United States, and the European Union. I'll then finally conclude and see whether we can get some good European answers. I'm especially honored that I'm speaking here in the presence of Margaret Vestager, who I have always admired, and I do think that she's not only the rock star of the European Commission, but one of the most pro-European, constructive Nordics that I have seen for many decades. Now, the 3 key dates. The Prime Minister mentioned, of course, Auschwitz and the atrocities that we saw during the Holocaust. I would argue that 1945 is the first key date, and the reason is quite simple. It's the end of World War II, and it's basically the beginning of a bipolar ideological world, where on one hand you have the United States and its allies, the capitalist model of liberal governance, and on the other hand you have, of course, communism, the Soviet Union, authoritarian regimes and their allies. That was also the beginning of the multilateral framework of governance, which is now under such severe strain and challenge worldwide. I'm not saying it was a time of relative peace, but it was a time of relative clarity. You knew where you stood. Then comes 1989, and I had the privilege of starting my studies in the United States, actually in Greenville, South Carolina. In those days. And of course, for a young, aspiring political scientist, international relations theorist, it was mind-boggling to see the Berlin Wall coming down, then later on the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991. And that was, of course, a sea change in the sense that it ends not history as such, but the ideological debate whether capitalism is better than communism, whether liberal democracies better than authoritarian centralized regimes. And I thought we packed all that in a bag and said, listen, the world is going to become Danish, the world is going to become Finnish, and a much better place for that. And of course, for a while, that's what happened in many ways. We were quite privileged to live in a world where a majority of nation states, 200 of them in the world, reverted to liberal democracy. In the beginning of the 20th century, there were 5 to 10 democracies. In the 1970s, there were 35. By the end of the century, last century, 1999, there were 210 democracies out of 200. So we were moving in the right direction. But then comes the third date. Of course, this period was very unipolar, led by the United States, undisputed superpower of the world. Then comes 2008, which in my mind doesn't necessarily spell the end of capitalism, but it does spell the end of an era. The financial crisis, Lehman Brothers, the Euro crisis. Then that combined with the asylum crisis, which the Prime Minister touched as well, gave us a sentiment that something had fundamentally changed. The whole model of democratic governance wasn't anymore necessarily coping with what stood at hand. And then as an Anglophile, I say this, in 2016 we had the double whammy of first the Brexit referendum and then secondly the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. And we all realized and understood that something has fundamentally changed. Not only the marginalization of the Anglo-Saxon world from the world scene, but something in democratic governance as well. So I would argue with these three dates, 1945, 1989, and 2008, the first shift was from ideology to identity. We are very homebound, nationalistic, rather than ideological, and we see that in the political scene today. Secondly, we moved from a bipolar to a unipolar, now to a multipolar world, which lacks a clear leadership structure. And then thirdly, we moved from world hegemony, first the Soviet Union, the United States, then the United States, to power vacuums. And the big question is, who is going to fill those power vacuums, whether they are in trade, whether they are in values, whether they are in technology or climate. That's the big, how would I say, race for power at the moment. And here's where I get to my second point, the three challenges and opportunities. I think there are three megatrends that all of us are trying to grapple with, and this is where I start my optimistic spiel about where Europe is going. The first challenge is climate and climate change. I was in Davos last week. The only talking town was climate change. You had American companies, American banks, multinationals fighting for the space of being as green as possible. And I would argue that the Nordic states, not only with their aims of becoming carbon neutral or 70% or 100% in Finland by 2035 as stands, or the European Union by 2050, we have a competitive advantage on this. Everyone wants to be green, everyone wants to do climate at the moment. And that is, of course, a universal and existential challenge. Second one is technology, and I'm sure Lykke and I will speak about it more. I think that the fourth industrial revolution, or the digital revolution, will change everything. It will, number one, change the economy and the way in which we work. Number two, it will change politics, media, and the way in which we communicate. And number three, it will change science and actually the future of mankind. I leave you that as a teaser and hope that Lykke will ask me a couple of questions about it. But this is the most disruptive force that society has seen for decades. If you remember the first industrial revolution, the steam engine, electricity, it brought with it Marxism. Take that 100 times and you know where the fourth industrial revolution is going. We could very much be, and I'm not scaremongering, on the verge of creating a society whereby we could potentially have, in the words of Yuval Harari, a useless class, a class which does not care about politics, a class which has no economic value added. And that, of course, looking at it from the perspective of mankind, human decency and human values, is a horrific perspective. And number three, I would argue that one of the megatrends and challenges that we have is welfare. And here I'm talking pretty much, as a Nordic, a combination of capitalism and socialism, the Nordic model. We have been, with our capitalist model, extremely good at baking the cake. But one of the few parts of the world which has been good at sharing that cake has been the Nordic countries, not so in the rest of the world. And this is not putting us on pedestal, it's just saying the reality. If you look at all of the statistics that we see about the Nordic countries, whether it's environment, welfare, Gini coefficients, transparency, rule of law, you name it, we're always top 10. And it's always, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, well, Sweden sort of, Norway, trying to fight for that position. And I think welfare is going to be the big issue because, baking the cake eternally, that's all cool, but there's still a whole bunch of people out there who are extremely disappointed with where they stand. I'll give you one example. I was at a debate on Brexit. A British minister said, I don't understand why Brexit is happening because UK's GDP has been growing X, Y, and Z. Someone spontaneously from the audience shouted, yeah, perhaps your GDP, mate, not mine. When that welfare sentiment is there, we have to take it very seriously. And then I come to my third point before the conclusion. I think there are three models that are trying to solve these issues of climate, technology, and welfare. And they are in many ways very different, albeit global and fairly well known. I'm simplifying. Model number one is China. It's centralized, it's authoritarian, and it's capitalistic, and it's massive on scale. Can it solve climate, technology, and welfare? I don't know. Second, the United States. It's decentralized, it's democratic, it's polarized, and very capitalistic. Can it solve the problems beyond the rhetoric of Donald Trump in today's world? I don't know. And thirdly, here's where I'm the optimist. I think there is a third model, and that's the European Union. It's decentralized, it's messy, it's democratic, but very much prone to compromise, as actually the Prime Minister said, and as the previous panelists said as well. We're very quick at criticizing the European Union, blaming the European Union for stuff, not least the debate on budget. But nevertheless, could it provide a solution? And here's where I say perhaps. I will conclude by saying the following. If the number one mega challenge of the global community today is climate change, I think that the EU has a competitive edge on this for two reasons. Number one, it's a regulatory superpower. Whether you like it or not, when the EU regulates, the rest of the world follows. You don't have to be a Margaret Vestager to know why I say this. When she legislates or takes a decision on competition policy, the rest of the world follows. It's as simple as that. Secondly, I don't see any other place where there is as much public money right now in the sphere of climate financing than the European Union. And this I say as a little bit of a commercial break for the European Investment Bank, my previous employer, which is the biggest multilateral bank in the world, 3 times bigger than the World Bank. It is the Bank of the European Union, its member states, and it has pledged that 50% of all of its investments, roughly 40 billion euros per annum, will be on climate by 2025. Will the US market-based system be able to solve the climate crisis? I don't know. There's a lot of movement there, but the US is not going to do it from a regulatory perspective. It's doing it bottom-up from a decentralized state-based perspective. It might work, it might not work. I know COP is especially important in Denmark. And yes, we should look at that. But look at the action underneath, bubbling the COP, and that's what counts. China, I'm not 100% sure. The problem and the paradox with China is that it is obviously the biggest polluter, or one of the biggest polluters, but a lot of its current status and raison d'être and growth is based on not climate-friendly industries. If it starts cutting those down, I'm not sure that the Chinese society will survive. Second, technology. Here, Kai-Fu Lee, AI superpowers, his basic argument is there are only 2 guys in town, one is China and one is the United States. Perhaps if you look at Fortune 500, top 10, 20 tech companies, yes, none of them are European. But I think the jury is still out on that. You know, big tech giants come and go. Remember just a few years back, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google couldn't do anything wrong. They were very much seen as the ethical, pro-globalization, liberate the general public type of companies. But look at them right now. I'm not saying they're as unpopular as politicians, but not far away. So this could change with regulation and with antitrust competition policy as well. And on the technological side, I think we're going to face enormous ethical and moral issues. I want the good guys to do the algorithms, not the bad guys. And I think, again, a regulatory superpower which is used to forging compromise could very easily take the lead on this. My final and third test is welfare. And here, listen, the EU has 28, soon 27 welfare states. No, they're not all semi-perfect Nordic welfare states. But there is an element of that social consciousness in the system, combined with openness, free market, and internationalism. Whereas in the United States, it's not there. It's very binary. It is Trump or not, if you will. And that will provide, and believe me, I'm a strong transatlanticist, a lover of the US model, but they will have enormous problems. If you go to the United States today, look at the infrastructure. And I'm not only talking about the social infrastructure, just in general. It's not a healthy society. And then finally, of course, China. Welfare. You know, if you can't breathe the air, you don't feel very good. If you are controlled all the time, no matter how Confucian you are, it's not necessarily good for a free form of life. So I'm not sure it's going to be able to do that. So I want to leave you not with only the 3 dates, the 3 challenges, and the 3 power centers, but with a sense of optimism that I think the next decade is actually going to be a European decade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that optimistic sort of keynote. I remember still the first time I met you. You asked me a very simple question. What is the difference?
Will you marry me? No.
No. What's it? It was far more sort of specific and sort of humoristic than that.
Oh, God.
Yeah. What's the difference between an introvert and an extroverted Finn?
Yes.
That's why I put on blue shoes today.
Very good.
So what's the difference?
Yeah, I know. We Finns are a bit shy. So the introvert Finn, when he talks to you, he sort of looks at his own feet. And the extrovert Finn, when he talks to you, he looks at your feet.
Well, thank you once again for completely underlining that you do not fit any of the boxes, one will have to say. You took a chance on us. For you, it was never about money, money, money. The gimme, gimme, the voulez-vous. It was more, I have a dream, mamma mia. Enlighten the audience. Alex, what is this?
Well, it was Werner Hoyer's, who is the president of the European Investment Bank, farewell speech for me, and he obviously realized that I'm a big ABBA fan and plugged it into the EIB. I thought it was quite funny and well put, actually.
Yeah, and I was inspired by that, so let's continue on that sort of note. So the winner takes it all was where I wanted to start. And you alluded to the fact that on the 13th of June, something very, very important will happen here in Copenhagen, because Finland will play Denmark. So it'll be in football, obviously, European Championship in football. So Pukki Power against Eriksen. But then I thought, okay, Denmark will win, so let's not go into that.
I was in Hofbräu House in 1992 in Bavaria with a Danish flag and 4 friends, and I almost got beat.
Then I thought about, well, we should move on to Dancing Queen, but then I thought about Theresa May walking in here, dancing, and then I thought, okay, but let's have, when all is said and done, so Brexit. We heard the Prime Minister sort of making more or less the case that Brexit was due to free movement of workers. Did you agree on that? Or were there other sort of reasons for Brexit? How do you look upon it now? Could we have avoided the situation that will now happen on Friday where the flag will be pulled down?
Yeah, avoid or not, I think one of the big problems in the United Kingdom was that for 40 years they were pretty much the reluctant bride. They weren't 100% sure whether they would be, whether they would be in or out. And I think the Luxembourg Prime Minister put it very well when he said that, UK membership has previously been about being in with a whole bunch of opt-outs. Now they're going to be out with a whole bunch of opt-ins. And I think that's what's going to happen. But the inevitability of Brexit, the big problem was actually the British media. If you basically, criticize the European Union from morning to night and make up stories about it. I mean, they were very much, I think, pioneers in fake news. In the 1990s, it's then very difficult to go to the general public and ask the question, well, do you think this is a good club or a bad club? I think the answer is going to be quite, inevitable. I must admit that I have a bit of a stake in this. My wife is British, or actually British and Finnish now, and our children have dual nationality. So, of course, come 1st of February, it's going to be quite a sad day for us. Just to sum it up, I think the whole Brexit idea is crazy. It's a little bit like leaving the internet. I mean, you can do that, but it's better to try to, influence the content. My eternal optimist in me says that the 1st of February 2020 they leave, and the 1st of February 2030 they'll come and knocking on the door again, but the world will change.
The Prime Minister also touched upon sort of the fact that Denmark would have to look for new allies. And you said that being a former Prime Minister is the best title you can come up with. But if now you had received that question, being now the Prime Minister of Denmark, or for that matter, Prime Minister of Finland, what would have been your take on that particular question? I mean, here we heard a lot about flexible sort of allies.
Yeah, on the 2 questions, and to give you a direct answer, the nice thing is now that I'm an ex-Prime Minister, I can say what I think. On the free movement question that you asked, I perhaps disagree with the Prime Minister a little bit on that one. I think it was a blessing in disguise for the sort of post-Cool Britannia phenomenon and getting more labour into the system. But at the same time, I do understand some of the general British public, because you can't go into a British pub anymore and get good service in a British accent. It doesn't work like that. So,
but we agree upon the fact that they had the opportunity to use the transition phase,
and
which they didn't.
This is the interesting thing. The Brits were always very anti-European in rhetoric, but actually pro-European in action. They were one of the only countries that went for free movement. At the time, from what I recall, they expected about 50,000 people maximum to come in, and then 1 million came to seek for work. So that changed the game. Now, where I agree with the Prime Minister was on the coalitions. You know, the world is messy. You have to find, as a small state or medium-sized power, you have to find coalitions in various forms. The UK was a great partner when it came to economic reform, the Services Directive, the internal market, but not necessarily a good companion when it came to institutional reform. You know, on agriculture, you might seek some help from France or even Finland, depending on the line that you take. When it comes to the budget negotiations, you have to be really, really, I think, canny. I negotiated the 2014 to 2020 budget for Finland as Europe Minister, and then we were very much a double-edged sword. On one hand, we wanted to protect agriculture. On the other hand, we wanted to put money into innovation, jobs and growth. And then on top of that, we were on the net receiver side. So you really had to play again. You have to be very flexible. You have to be flexible with your coalitions as well.
And do you see any chances or need for greater Nordic cooperation?
Yeah,
with
definitely.
Brexit?
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to, you know, tighten up even more than we are already. I mean, of course, before every European Council, we actually had a Nordic-Baltic meeting, Nordic prime ministers, foreign ministers. We meet all the time. The sort of association or membership discrepancy is a little bit complicated because, of course, you know, Finland is in the Euro and the European Union, but unfortunately not in NATO, whereas you are in the European Union and NATO, but unfortunately not in the EU, and then you have a couple of opt-outs. Sweden doesn't have an opt-out, but it's not in the Euro and not in NATO. So, you know, it doesn't make life easier, but when it comes to economic reform, when it comes to basic values, when it comes to climate change, you know, we're like brothers and sisters, and it's always easy to work with the Danes and the Swedes and the Finns.
And moving on to the budget as such, we heard sort of the previous speaker speaking a lot about sort of digitalization, so the need also to invest. Then we heard the Prime Minister saying that, well, but then you have to cut other areas. I mean, like, whatever, administration, aquaculture, and so forth. But if you look upon the world, and that's sort of also, I mean, the job you've had now at European Investment Bank, and you read sort of the figures of how other sort of areas in the world are investing in research, particularly the digital area. What's your take then on the budget? Is it possible to just have a budget of more or less 1% of the overall GDP of the overall EU, and then sort of still sort of invest heavily in new areas?
Yeah, I guess the first observation is that we have to realize that the EU budget is 1% of the GNI of the whole area. So sometimes you could be a bit Shakespearean and say much ado about nothing, but as a matter of fact, it is 1 trillion over 7 years, so it is money. The big problem that we have there, it's one of the biggest public relations exercises a member state or a prime minister has. Everyone, he or she, has to come out of that final overnight negotiation saying, look what I achieved for my country. Everyone is sort of looking at, well, we don't really know, but if you say it went well, that's all good. It's not going to change the world. The redistributive power is still within the nation state and the welfare state. They do the education, they do the welfare, a lot of the infrastructure. But there are elements that we should use on that. And they are linked to, of course, climate, they are linked to innovation, they are linked to growth. But there's always going to be a fight between the net receivers and net contributors of who gets what out of the system. A final point on this, the way in which I saw, and I'm an EU nerd, I didn't know much about the EIB before I went there, but I do think that the EIB will actually be, in the future, a wonderful instrument. We saw that, for instance, with the Juncker plan. It was able to leverage finance and investment in the European Union up to 500 billion euros. And 500 billion euros, that's half of what the EU budget is over 7 years. We have a similar plan with InvestEU, and of course then the EIB has its own tickets as well, normal mandate. So there's going to be less and less public money and resources. So let's use the EIB to leverage. we have the lowest NPL, non-performing loan rate, I can't say we anymore, of the world. It's 0.3%. It's a bank which is very safe in that it's owned by 28, soon 27 member states. It has a AAA rating. When we go into a project with 50%, another 50% immediately crowds in. So I think we'll start seeing the use of these types of instruments more, but the problem is that, the EIB does positive stuff, and positive stuff is not media sexy, so you're not going to hear reports about it.
Mm. What about the migration issue, which the Prime Minister also touched upon?
Yeah, it's
How
a really...
on earth do we manage sort of to move ahead on that particular issue?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question.
I think to the budget, obviously.
Yeah, I can be very frank with you. I mean...
the former Prime Minister, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of political crises throughout my life. I was 8 years in government, but I've never had anything like the migration crisis. And I understand why people were, really scared about the situation. Yeah. 2015. I was finance minister. The only good thing is that then we hugged the true Finns to death, because they were in government and their popularity fell from 18% to 9%. When you're in power and these types of migration crises happen, populism is not exactly the talking town. Of course, they're now bounced back, but that's a different story. Now, what would I do? Well, I would try to prevent a similar type of a scenario, and I don't think that type of a scenario is likely to happen in the future. But we do need to find collective solutions. The problem I see is that a lot of governments, whether they are left and right, and I'm not making reference to the Danish government here, they turn inward. They start protecting their own system. And I see where that comes from. In Finland, we used to get 3,500 asylum seekers per annum. That year, 2015, we have 35,000. And you can imagine what that does to the general psyche and to the political system. But that's why we shouldn't... I think it's very important that we stay true to our values, which basically means that we try to find solutions which are both rational and workable in Europe. And that means that we have to have some kind of a connection with the countries of entry and some kind of a system for dealing with these asylum seekers. Fortunately, we don't have that crisis anymore, and this is where I disagree with a lot of European leaders. Please stop talking about asylum. We don't have an asylum problem in Europe at this particular moment. We have a perception, but if you look at the figures, they are normal. So let's try to prevent that it doesn't happen in the future instead. One final point. I come back to challenge number one, the climate issue. If we don't solve that, temperatures rise, 2015, go to 2050, 2015 will be a walk in the park.
And your own experience at Davos, you now also mentioned obviously the fourth industrial revolution, and you highlighted the fact that we could end up in a situation with a so-called useless class, as far as I understood you were saying. How do you see the EU's role in avoiding that?
Well, I think it's a big role because it's a regulatory role in many ways, and it has to be done in cooperation because the digital revolution, and Margaret has talked about it a lot throughout her years as a commissioner and otherwise. The first big change is the economy and work, whereby we start seeing a movement towards services, towards platform economies, towards economies driven by technology rather than traditional industry. And this means, major transformation. And linked to that is the new face of work. I've read a wonderful book called The 100-Year Life. You and I will have a career which is basically study, work, retire. My children who are 15 and 18, they're going to be study, work, study, work, study, work, die. So it's going to be completely different, and this
it's all
means
the sports you do.
Yeah, it means a total change in the way. And the problem is that you cannot change a coal miner overnight into a tech specialist. So we'll need a lot of transition in that. Then I'll leave the politics and media aside, but we are already now challenged. If you look at all the election results in Europe, they're extremely messy, apart from the latest UK election, which was quite specific. But we don't get clear results anymore, and this will continue. People keep on moving, and the way in which we communicate is different. I'll just mention one thing. You remember Kahneman's book on Think Slow, Think Fast? It had system 1, system 2. So system 1 is quick thinking and emotional and reactive, what you're doing right now. System 2 is slow, reflecting, seeking compromise. That's what you do when you're writing or or reading. Now, democracy was originally created for system 2. You know, John Locke and these guys, they talked about compromise and taking time and getting a solution. But we live in a democracy which is system 1, driven by technology. You know, in the 1990s, when Paul Skytte-Christoffersen and I were working together, when we were working, you had 24 hours at least to react to something. Now you have 24 seconds. You know, if something happens on the competition front and Margaret doesn't, you know, react to it, then, you know, she will get slaughtered. So we need to find a solution on that. And this is excluding science and mankind, future mankind. I think we're going to be faced with fundamental issues, and this is where fundamental moral and ethical issues, neural laces. I'll give you one example. DNA sequencing and CRISPR. When we can start impacting the hair color, the intelligence level, the color of the eyes, the muscle composition of an unborn child, that's when we get into a situation whereby not every human being is created equal. We have to find rules and regulations for that. I'm glad to see that there is a pushback on cloning, on different types of DNA sequencing, but this is where Europe comes in and could set the ethical standards together with others as well. I'm not saying that we become hybrids. I actually think we already are. I mean, all of us, we can't live without the mobile phones anymore. Technology, we're technology-driven individuals, but we have to start thinking about, you know, how we deal with this. Final point. It's also about, you know, you and I as human beings. The world is getting smaller, the virtual world, but the physical world is getting larger. I mean, look at yourself. What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? Do you kiss your spouse? Or do you look at the mobile phone? I'll leave it to you. You know, what's the first thing you do at breakfast? Do you have a conversation with your family at breakfast? Or are you all, Brexit, yeah. You know, are you all doing the thumb thing? So I'm saying it's changing the way in which we are, brain composition and reaction and the rest of it. So there are a lot of interesting things that I think Europe can be involved in this.
And final question, being in Davos, and also as Malte was saying, your overall point about that we may be in for disorder at the global level, and your hope that Europe could fill part of that vacuum. Can you also come forward with an optimist statement there? Will it be possible for the Ursula von der Leyen Commission to be the first geopolitical commission?
Definitely. Hands down, this is probably the best opportunity the European Union has had since the end of the Cold War. And why do I say this? I say it, number one, because Europe is always based on a big project. It could be the single market in the 1980s, early 1990s, the euro in the 90s, enlargement, institutional change in 2000. Now that big raison d'être, that big project, is climate. And the European Union has a competitive advantage. And for me, it's a double whammy. It's about the Commission's Green Deal, which is the politics, the guarantee and the money, and the policies and regulation behind the fight against climate change. You combine that with the other side of the double whammy, the EIB, which is the financier on this. And I'm extremely optimistic about what Europe can do. And we always also forget that Europe is a wonderful place to live. I mean, you know, I come to Denmark, you know, so I look around, you know, high-tech architecture, design, well-being, hytte, you know, hygge, and the rest of it. So, you know, we should think about these positive things. I think this Commission has defined the exact correct challenges, and the fact that they're talking about a geopolitical Europe, where geopolitics is also economics nowadays, is a good thing. So I'm very optimistic about what this Commission will achieve.
I guess we should end it there, but still, just to push back on that one, can you be a geopolitical commission and a geopolitical actor without sort of lots of defense capabilities? Is that possible?
Well, yes and no. I think, you know, the line between war and peace is very blurred nowadays. You could say that we are in a constant war, whether it's about information or cyber, whether it's about media, fake news, attacks on, you know, energy supply and the rest of it. If that's the case, I'm not saying that military is unnecessary, and I certainly don't say it as a non-NATO member with 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. But what I am saying is that the nature of conflict is different. The alternative cost of going into war, having military engagement and skirmishes, is simply too high. And again, I come back to the issue of welfare, I come back into the issue of technology. I think the focus should be on that. And Europe is always talked about as a soft power and sort of focused on economics. But listen, economics, trade is a form of warfare today. And when you have a market of over 400 million people, one of the biggest economies in the world, well, we have a good weapon there.
Let's end on that. Thank you very much. Thank you for the music.